Yeah, welcome everyone to Libreria Online. Today's event, I'm discussing the Gallery of Miracles and Madness with Charlie English. This is an incredible book about art, insanity, Hitler, which is always a big topic and quite a dark, complex character to investigate. And his first mass murder program. So yeah, keeping it light on a slightly cold autumnal night. Charlie is a journalist, a former journalist of The Guardian, a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society and author of the books, The Book Smugglers of Timbuktu and The Snow Tourist. Let's just briefly outline the book. So Charlie, the book starts off with Hans Prinzhorn, who's a significant character throughout, who amassed a collection of psychiatric art, and he was a glorious kind of self-promoter. And as a result of that, he became really influential to some of the great modern artists of the 20th century, but also his work and the work of the patients became, well, it drew the attention of Adolf Hitler and fed into his ideas of like the superior race, the Übermensch, and became the program for mass murder, which is, you know, a significant legacy of the Nazis. So I'm guessing the first question I wanted to ask was, what was the spark for the book? How did you uncover this story, and why did you choose to write it?
Well, I guess, I mean, I'm a storyteller, basically, so I thought that this story was just incredible, you know, because it covered so much of the kind of most dramatic moments of 20th century history. I mean, I like writing about cultural subjects, and I sort of started looking into the Prinzhorn collection story, which I think the connection between madness and modernism, I hadn't really understood how deep it ran. And but then to go from there through to the way that the Nazis used that connection seemed to me just something that I hadn't really heard of or read about before, and it felt kind of new, and something that I could do a good job of telling. So, you know, that really is what led me into it.
Okay, and the Prinzhorn collection, how did you hear of that? Because I studied fine art and it wasn't something I was aware of. So how did you learn of it?
I'd read a few articles about it. There was a show at the Hayward Gallery in, I think, 1998 when it came here, and I met someone at a book festival who'd sort of been to that show and told me how amazing it was, and it was much better than the kind of professional art that was also on in the same time. And then I just started kind of digging into it, researching it, traveling to Heidelberg, which is where this collection is, and talking to the curator there, and seeing some of it. And I think, you know, I think I wouldn't have wanted to write it if I hadn't thought the art was really powerful and amazing in its own way, because I guess that's a surprising thing about it. You don't expect it to be that good, but it obviously it's a very big collection. When Prinzhorn put it together, he put together, I mean, more than 5,000 pieces, and since then it's grown more because they're still collecting this kind of material. But I mean, the sort of the best bits of it are really, really powerful and really kind of emotionally engaging, and in a way that I think is a surprise. Yeah.
Yeah, and how did you select the artists that you choose to write about? Because there were hundreds, if not thousands, of patients that contributed to this collection, but you focus on like a dozen, and then you pick out a specific hero, as you called it in the green room.
Mm.
which is Franz Karl Bueller. How did you
Well,
discover him?
I mean, Prinzhorn wrote a book about the collection in 1922 called, in English, it's called Artistry of the Mentally Ill. And within that book, he has I mean, the kind of central piece of it is about what he calls the 10 schizophrenic masters that he's discovered in the course of putting this collection together. And Bueller is the star, if you like, among those 10 schizophrenic masters. So that was kind of a, you know, an early a gift to me, really, that I could follow him. And the fact that he was also at the end of the story, which is in the kind of psychiatric Holocaust in 1940, and was put in a gas chamber, meant that his life told the full extent of the story that I think needed to be told. But then, you know, beyond him, there are a kind of range of other famous Prinzhorn artists, and I tried to follow some of them. And there's a guy called August Natterer who was very influential with the surrealists, and it made sense to put a bit about his life in as well. I mean, there's only so much you can do in a book, you know, without just sort of losing the focus. So I couldn't cover the whole terrain, but I sort of did. I thought what I could with what I had. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the strength of the book is how incredibly focused it is on a handful of artists and the influence, but also how broad a sweep of history you covered, and in such great detail. You talk about Prinzhorn and Heidelberg, the clinic's work. But also you touch on Hitler. How did you, when you were writing about Hitler, how do you try and find something new? Like you mentioned, like the artist Führer idea.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to not do what has been written so many times about Hitler, not write a kind of biography of the politician. And I wanted to, because it's a book about art, I wanted to kind of explore the artistic side of Hitler. And of course, I found that even in his later life, he thought he was an artist. And that to me seemed interesting. And quite substantial figures in, contemporary figures in Germany thought that he was basically an artist, even when he was a fascist dictator. Thomas Mann, for instance, said, you know, you've got to recognize that there's something of an artist about Hitler. So even though he failed really as a professional artist, he failed famously to get into the Vienna Academy. He ended up just painting kind of tourist scenes around Vienna and Munich, and really failed as a watercolorist or a painter. A lot of people have made the point that his politics was really a sort of art, in that it was a show. It was about marching, design, the searchlights that Albert Speer put on in these kind of Nuremberg rallies, the uniforms. I mean, there's something kind of artistic about the whole politics of him, and of course the performances. I mean, his speeches, which are just kind of very. I mean, he worked hard. He practiced these sort of movements and his gestures that seem very alien to us now, but they clearly worked with a kind of live audience. So, and then, he was portrayed by his propagandists, by Goebbels, as the artist Führer, the artist in chief. There's this great cartoon in a sort of magazine from the 30s, which shows him as the Bildhauer von Deutschland, the sculptor of Germany, and his it kind of makes the point that this redesigning of the German people was itself a kind of sculptural project. I mean, it's all incredibly sick, I have to say, and I don't want anyone to think that this is a sort of tacit softening, but I think it can be evil and horrible, but also at the same time artistic in a sense. And I guess I found that very interesting.
Yeah, I think it's a credit to your book that there's nothing celebratory about the theatre of Hitler, but you do talk about his ideas stemming from writing Mein Kampf in jail, his ideas of wanting to be an artist at a young age and going against his father. And you alluded to it there with the practice of his speeches and performance of orating those. And he tried those out. He kind of practiced his ideas on audiences before he ascended to power, didn't he?
Well, I think, yeah. I mean, there's various levels of practicing, but there's a collection of Heinrich Hoffmann photographs of him practicing these gestures specifically, and they're very sort of elaborately shot. But there's obviously a kind of repertoire of gestures that he is creating. But then I guess the practice, really, the birth of him, I imagine, I think, as a politician, was in his early speeches in the beer halls, where his technique was to just throw stuff, sort of angry stuff, at the audience and see what worked, and I think some of the ideology was built up in a kind of live action, as it were. He kind of worked out what hit the spot. And you read Mein Kampf, or you read about him and what he said at that time, and it doesn't make any sense. I mean, there's no the worldview that he built up there's no logic to it. It doesn't hold together. It doesn't hold up to the kind of slightest scrutiny, this kind of paranoid ideas that he had. But I think it didn't really matter with the people he was talking to, that he spoke emotionally. He appealed to people's emotions. And I guess that's what a demagogue does. But he managed to just hit these buttons, and people didn't really question whether that made any logical sense or not. It just worked. He had this, I think an expression of his was Rassengefühl, which means racial feeling, and he knew that a certain segment of the German people, or of his audience, would get this kind of racial feeling, this kind of emotional feeling when he was talking, and he played on that.
Yeah, because the idea that blood was one of the kind of key components that he landed on when he threw as much mud to see what stuck with the populace, with the audiences, and then the idea of blood became the idea of the superior race, and you had these ideas in the wider discourse around degeneracy and eugenics. How did those discourses influence his outlook on what made good art, and how did art shape the nation that he envisaged?
Well, he was borrowing these ideas. I mean, they weren't really his, in a sense. They were, as you say, around in the kind of ether at that point. By the late 19th century, there were a lot of what we might call pseudo-scientific ideas about race and the superiority or hierarchy of race, which had really begun in the 1850s or even earlier, but then had been built by various thinkers. There was a guy called Max Nordau who wrote a book called Degeneracy, which they took Darwinism, if you like, and inverted it. So if nations could evolve, they could also kind of devolve. So the idea was that you could racially and culturally descend, and so in this theory, the white races were in the top of the hierarchy, and the Aryans were the kind of super top of the white races, and the Aryans were also the only people who could create culture. I mean, this was literally a kind of a theory that was written shortly before 1900 that Hitler borrowed, and so there's a sense that you can sort of create a slight paranoia around the culture descending and becoming degenerate. And the most significant symptom, if you like, of that culture going wrong for Hitler in his propaganda was art. So, you know, the sort of art that Hitler liked was very detailed, very sort of technical, late 19th century, late romantic stuff. And so when the modernists and the expressionists came along and turned that all on its head, and they didn't even try to be really representational in the same way, Hitler could make the argument that this was art falling into degeneracy. So art was going wrong, and this was a symptom of the race becoming degenerate because of the influx of Jews and immigrants and so on. And so he used degeneracy as a political tool in the 1930s, well, from Mein Kampf and onwards.
Well, what he terms degeneracy in art was more a reflection of the aftermath of World War I. A lot of the sane artists that you mentioned, like some of the key figures, they looked to the sanatorium and the psychiatric clinics to explore the turmoil and the trauma, didn't they?
That's right. I mean, you know, you had Freud in the late 19th century sort of opening up this new landscape within the kind of interior world that modernists got very interested in. You had a move away from the art academy system, which had dominated art before then, but didn't seem relevant anymore. You know, to paint these kind of classical themes endlessly in different ways wasn't of any interest to the kind of people of the early artists of the early 20th century, or some of them anyway. A group of avant-garde. And the expressionists began to look, even before the war, into madness and the art of children and what they called primitivism as a way to kind of explore the real human interior. You know, it was a way to sort of look at what the human condition is about, I suppose you'd say. And then, of course, the war happened, and you know, tens of millions of people were killed, but also the whole of Europe really was traumatized. And a lot of the artists themselves were sent to fight in the war. A lot of them had nervous breakdowns, suffered depression afterwards. And when they came home, they wanted to depict what they'd found. And I mean, at the same time, in the middle of the war, European Dada was launched, which was a kind of deliberately anti-rationalist sort of art. And I mean, it seemed to them and to the surrealists, certainly starting up in Paris after the war, that rationalism had got the world into an awful lot of trouble. And there was a sort of a moral goodness in madness, because it distanced you from the terrible decisions that the rational people had made. So, yeah, I mean, come 1919, avant-garde artists all over Europe were exploring madness in a really serious way. And that is, of course, when Prinzhorn's collection really gets launched into the world. And so they pick it up in a very, you know, eager fashion.
Yeah, the Prinzhorn collection, the way it was discovered by the modernists was in the book that was published. Hans Prinzhorn even kind of worked towards, and it was a 2.5-year project of his, which is quite incredible what he achieved in such a short span of time. I'm guessing what I wish to ask is, how did that book come to be, and how did it get to Paris or France?
Well, Prinzhorn had been collecting since about January, February 1919. So he had all these works came into the Heidelberg psychiatric hospital where he was working. And he, at one point, wanted to have a gallery of psychiatric art within the university clinic. But for various reasons, he couldn't get the funding. I think he probably always wanted to write a book to put his findings together, and he was very pedantic about what type of book it was going to be. You know, he argued with his publisher quite a lot about how many images that were going to be in it, but the fact that he didn't get his art gallery meant that he wanted to turn his book into a kind of virtual art gallery. So it's full of amazing images. I mean, given that it's published in 1922, it's a very rich kind of coffee table book, and it's, you know, it became a kind of big hit among the avant-garde at the time. So a lot of artists saw it. I mean, there's a story about Paul Klee, who worked at the Bauhaus, you know, discussing with a friend insanity and art, and pulling down Prinzhorn's book from a shelf and kind of going through it and saying how brilliant it is, and it's how much like Klee's work it is. And that's one of the things that there was a real sort of synchronicity, if you like, between this the art of that time and the art that was in Prinzhorn's book. I mean, it looks very similar. But then Max Ernst got hold of a copy. He was a Dadaist in 1919, and he left Cologne, where he was had a young family, and went to set up a ménage à trois with Paul Eluard in Paris, who's like a friend of André Breton, and he takes a copy of the book with him. And so the book is then sort of circulating among the group around Breton that will become the Surrealist movement. And it becomes a kind of real central fixture of Surrealism, so that it's known as the Surrealist Bible, you know, not long afterwards. And people like Dali refer to it, and André Masson, who's a Surrealist painter. And I guess the idea is that, I mean, the Surrealists really worshipped insanity. I mean, Breton was absolutely fascinated with it, and they thought it held the key to understanding human nature, I guess.
Yeah. And
so they tried to emulate mad art, as it was called, and they would try and create techniques. I mean, the problem for them, of course, was that they weren't actually mad. And there's this story that Dali spent the entire 1920s trying to go mad, but failed to do so. Yeah. So instead of being mad, he developed various techniques. He had a method called the paranoid critical method, I think it was, where he tried to sort of get himself into a psychotic state. I mean, I don't know really quite how, but they clearly looked at Prinzhorn's book and were kind of deliberately trying to find techniques that would help them create that kind of stuff.
Yeah, because Breton devised automatic writing as a result of seeing work in the Prinzhorn collection. And was it who was it that formed or developed the use of collage to
Max Ernst?
Max Ernst, it was him. Yeah, I was a bit unsure. He was heavily indebted to the work he saw in the collection. I mean, to the point of appropriation in some cases.
Yeah, I mean, there are several works. I mean, Ernst has been quite closely followed, his connection with the Prinzhorn collection. He was, when he was a student in Bonn, he had been taken to a psychiatric institution in Bonn, a kind of asylum that was part of the hospital, and they had a patient art collection there, and he'd seen that stuff and was very kind of moved by it, and that was before the war. So he was always, even then, was interested, and he at one point he even thought about trying to produce a book of psychiatric art, but Prinzhorn obviously got there before him, and so he used collage as a way of creating these absurd juxtapositions, you know, from magazine cutouts that were characters in his paintings, and he found there was a sort of resemblance to psychosis, I think, in that. And then, but yeah, he used the Prinzhorn book very in a very detailed way, and there are some images that are very similar that he's produced subsequent to Prinzhorn that people have attributed to August Natterer in particular. I mean, there's an image of a floating female figure that Natterer produced, and Ernst created something very like it a bit later.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got to be careful. I mean, some things just look like something else, and you say, well, that's obviously influenced by that, and it's not necessarily the case. But it's a fairly well reported idea now that Ernst used the Prinzhorn collection.
Yeah, I mean, the Ernst Oedipus looks very, very similar to Natterer's. Yeah. It's uncanny, but when you look at like the hero of the book, Bühler, his self-portrait, Das Selbst, that when you first look at it, you instantly think of someone like Edvard Munch, The Scream. You might think of other artists that tackled similar kind of acts of despair, but can we briefly talk about Bühler and how he broke rules, even though he was quite an exquisite artist in his own right?
Yeah, I mean, Bühler was interesting. I mean, as I said, he was picked out by Prinzhorn as the best of the lot, and also by other people at the time, like Alfred Kubin, who was an expressionist artist who thought Bühler was really extraordinary, and he couldn't believe that he was in an asylum, you know. Bühler had, I mean, he was a metalsmith by trade. He came out of that kind of arts and crafts tradition of making really elaborate Rococo kind of what you might call municipal street furniture. I mean, he made sort of park gates and balconies and you know, railings and things like that, and in very floral kind of forms, and won prizes for that, but clearly had a mental health issue. He, in 1898, he was, which is how I started the book, he's basically in a paranoid psychotic state in Hamburg, and he thinks he's being chased by some spies who've been sent by his former boss at Strasbourg School of Crafts, and he's fleeing from these imaginary people, as he has been for months, and jumps into a canal to try and get across it to escape. And it's, I can't remember now, I think it's February or March, so it's absolutely freezing, and nobody in their right mind, should we say, would do that, especially not to flee some people who aren't there. So he is sectioned at that point, and you know, this is a point where there aren't any antipsychotic drugs. Schizophrenia hasn't really even been created as a diagnosis, and so there's no treatment, and all they really do is put you away in a place that's away from the rest of the society, and keep you there. And I think what's Bühler clearly realized about, I don't know, 6 months into his incarceration, that he wasn't getting out, and he's quite shocked by that. So what he does instead is start to observe his fellow patients, and he starts drawing his fellow patients, and he produces these. I mean, he's already an artist of sorts, you know, he's a craftsman really, so he's not unskilled, and he draws everyday life in the asylum and produces these quite extraordinary pencil sketches. And then as he progresses through the asylum system for the next 20 years, which is when Prinzhorn first meets him, he goes to meet him in 1920, I think it is. By that point, he's really become a really skillful fine artist, and he's taught himself how to paint, how to use crayons and color and so on. But he's also portraying what Prinzhorn thinks are his psychotic moments. So there are these kind of weird, fantastical creatures. There's one where there's a sort of a portrait of a head and shoulders portrait has leapt off the wall, and he's drawn a kind of body with the head and shoulders portrait. So it's like the artwork has kind of come to life. And yeah, I mean, Prinzhorn is just kind of bowled over by this. He thinks it's really wonderful art, and he compares him to Van Gogh and Grunewald and people like that.
Yeah, Albert Dürer is another one that he was compared to, which is high praise. I guess once the link between the sane artists and the psychiatric artists has been formed through the work becoming quite prominent, how did Hitler latch onto this, and why did he use it for propaganda purposes?
Well, Hitler his sense of art is sort of caught in aspic. It's completely conservative in an extreme conservative way. I think Albert Speer says he's stuck in this time of his youth, between about 1880 and 1910, and he can't or doesn't want to understand what modernism is trying to do. And he likes, like Max Nordau, who wrote the Degeneracy text, he likes representational art. I mean, he rails against artists who don't use naturalistic colors, which is what a lot of modernists were trying to do at that time. In Mein Kampf, he calls Cubism and Dada the excrescences of insane and degenerate men. He's absolutely kind of furious or using that fury against that sort of art for political purposes. So he's doing that from the early 1920s. It's not clear if he read Prinzhorn's book, but he would have been exposed to its ideas at that time. And then the Nazis get into power, obviously, in 1933, and there's a little hiatus where, Hitler declares very quickly that he's going to restore German culture and restore German art. And his first architectural commission is this immense art gallery, the House of German Art, which is commissioned for a centerpiece of Munich, of the redeveloped Munich. And he tries to encourage a kind of new style of Nazi art that will fit into this new gallery he's building, but it doesn't really work. It's not really clear what he approves of. There's a lot of stuff he hates or lambasts in public, but no one really knows what art Hitler wants. There are very few good Nazi artists. It's just kind of a contradiction in terms, if you like. But in 1937, Goebbels, having listened to Hitler's views on art for many years, decides that it would be a good idea to put on a kind of shaming show of modern art, which is the origin of the first degenerate art show that the Nazi state puts on, which happens in Munich in July 1937. And the idea is that the state-sanctioned House of German Art is opening on one side of this street in Munich, in this glorious new building. And across the way, in this kind of rundown little sort of arcade, they put on the modernist art that they hate so much. And so Goebbels commissions this Nazi guy to go around all the galleries in Germany, collect all the expressionist and modernist art that they disapprove of, and bring it to Munich, where they put it on in the Hofgarten arcades. And they don't just kind of show it like you would at a normal art show. They hang it kind of badly in different weird patterns, and they put signs up saying how terrible it is and how much it cost and who bought it. And the idea is that it's a sort of theatrical production, and it's overcrowded deliberately. It's a small venue, but they bus lots of people in. And there's even talk that they hire actors to go around the gallery and sort of slag off the art to the punters as they view it, you know. And it becomes an incredible success, and it's still now the most visited art show of all time, as I understand it. I mean, something like I think maybe about 4 million people go and see this show. I mean, it's not just in Munich, it then tours around Germany. And it's obviously not an art show in the sense that it's promoting the art. I mean, the idea is it's trying to shame the art, but it's extremely popular. And then from Berlin, which is the second leg of the show, they add Prinzhorn works into it. So they put they'll put a Prinzhorn work next to a Oskar Kokoschka and say, you know, look, this is a drawing by a true lunatic, and it's better than what this professional artist Oskar Kokoschka, who was hailed as a genius, it's better than what he could produce.
And you mentioned that they put the kind of annotations alongside the paintings and specified how much these paintings cost, and it was slightly augmented by the hyperinflation period of Weimar Republic in some cases, but that idea of money being spent on art then became fuel for the Nazi propaganda machine, not just on art. It was also the money spent on maintaining psychiatric care, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, they started to run down the psychiatric institutions because Hitler's ideology about art was the same ideology that he used with people. I mean, I suppose that's really the connection I'm trying to make in the center of the book, that the idea that you could be a degenerate in cultural terms was mapped onto racial degeneracy too, or vice versa. So they started trying to eradicate people they saw as polluting the ethnic German race. And they began with the psychiatric patients because they thought that these people were somehow genetically ill, and that they were the Jewish people and mad people were polluting the gene pool, if you like, of the Aryan Nordic German. And so state policy was to get rid of them. And the first thing they did was start sterilizing them, which began really, the first sterilization legislation went through in the summer of '33. So really within a few months of Hitler coming to power. And they would sterilize about 400,000 psychiatric patients. But they also began to run down the asylums because they made the argument in public that these people were costing money. You know, they were useless eaters was one of the expressions they used, or life unworthy of life, or ballast existences, people who were too ill to be living, really. Yeah. And that therefore they should be, well, in the end, it ended up in a kind of euthanasia. They called it euthanasia, but it was a murder campaign against the mentally ill. Yeah.
Yeah, and then that they realised that it wasn't as I hate saying this word, productive enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they started exploring how to scale up. I'm sorry, that sounds really sick, but
No. I mean, it's true. I mean, they you mean in killing terms, they weren't killing people quickly enough. Yeah. I mean, they had all sorts of bizarre experiments in how to kill people quickly, and they I mean, they injected people with overdoses. They starved them, but they soon, when Hitler signed the order for this to go ahead, they began to do it more systematically, and they asked it was actually the kind of criminal technical institute within the Third Reich to come up with a way to kill people quickly, and they came up with this idea of carbon monoxide and gas chambers. So the first gassing was of some mentally ill people, some psychiatric patients in Brandenburg, in an experiment there, and then they built a prototype killing center about 30 miles outside Stuttgart, in an old castle there that they chose because it was far enough away from a population center, but still close enough to the kind of psychiatric hospitals, institutions. And so Bühler was taken there in, I think it was April 1940. It was a secret SS-led operation, which even the kind of wardens of these psychiatric institutions didn't really know about. I mean, it's a bit unclear how much they knew, but the buses would show up, they'd have names on lists, they'd load them onto the buses, tell them they were going to a new place. They'd arrive at this center. There was a sort of barracks building with all these, a dormitory with 100 beds that were made up, but nobody ever slept in the beds because they didn't stay alive long enough. They were given a kind of cursory medical examination, but that was really just to give them a plausible cause of death when they filled in a fake death certificate. And if they had gold teeth, this was marked on their back. And then they were pushed across into an old coach house that had been turned into what looked like a shower room, but in fact was a gas chamber. And there was a doctor sitting just next door, looking at them through a kind of observation window, and he'd open the gas when he was ready, and then kill them all, and then they would burn their bodies in an oven. And this was the system. Obviously, they later took to the camps in the East for the Holocaust.
Yeah, and I guess the question that I really want to ask is why, like, the rumors were circulating about what was going on in this facility. Why was there no kind of collective uprising? There's only instances of individuals trying to subvert. Why do you think that happens in this time or in any time?
Well, I think it's a hard one to answer, really. I mean, I guess you can argue there's by that time there's been 7 years of Nazi state propaganda against this population. There's probably a general agreement that the mentally ill are disposable, expensive. I mean, Germany wasn't unique in sterilizing people. The United States had been sterilizing people earlier in the century in certain states. I mean, there was clearly an insufficient amount of protest, and that's, you know, there were people who were benefiting financially from this operation who sold them the food and the drink and the bars and the, you know, there was a whole SS team there and people who serviced their vehicles and so on. But it's hard to say. I mean, I suppose you could argue that the people who complained would be threatened with being sent to concentration camps themselves, and there was a bit of that.
Yeah.
but it's not really sufficient to explain how it happened. And I don't think I'm not saying it's a kind of uniquely German situation. I think it probably could happen almost anywhere in the world with the right circumstances. And the circumstances were that the nation had been, brutalized for quite a long time, and that people can be persuaded to do this kind of thing.
Charlie, why do you think the work of the modernists, who borrowed so heavily from the psychiatric patients, why do you think their work has more legitimacy and value as a creative act?
Today, you mean, or then?
Both, yeah. Like someone like Buehler, their work, if it's exquisite, why is it not valued in the same way? Why is it not worth millions?
Well, I think it's a legacy of the ideas that people had at that time, really. I mean, there were people writing at that time that to be sort of categorized as insane, it made it impossible that you could create art. I mean, one psychiatrist at the time writes that all they can do is express their kind of illness onto the page, as it were. So it's sick art, it's ill, it's not art. And art, I think at that time, had a slightly different social place. I mean, I think it was held more highly in society probably than it is now. Yeah. Artists were thought of as visionaries. One of the reasons Hitler wanted to portray himself as the artist Führer was that it gave him a sort of credibility as a visionary, someone who could invent the idea of the future and then begin to move the Germans towards it. And now I don't think, I think we hold art in a slightly different social place. But it's an interesting point. I mean, I think after the war, there was a sort of gradual increase in interest in this kind of material. And there's an artist called Jean Dubuffet who visited Heidelberg in the 50s, and really, I mean, he'd seen Prinzhorn's book in the 20s, but he came to Heidelberg in the 50s with this idea that he was going to democratize art, expand the number of people who were allowed to make art, and really try and bring it out of the hands of the elite. And he created this thing called art brut, raw art, which was, I suppose, the beginnings of what we later called outsider art. And outsider art is a kind of growing phenomenon, but it's still not really seen. I mean, you don't get the prices, of course, that you do for a kind of Damien Hirst or something. Though I do notice that there's a friend of mine told me the Turner show has a neurodiverse group in it, I think in the shortlist for this year's Turner. So it's going in the right direction, but we're still not really quite there, I guess.
No, I guess you have to jump through certain hoops to get that kind of legitimacy. But yeah, art definitely doesn't hold the same place in society now. I think the last time I remember anything like resembling uproar is the YBA's Royal Academy sensation show, where the Sun newspaper were like fish and chips, and the Myra Hindley painting by Marcus Harvey, which I think it's a bit of a one-liner, but it caused a lot of consternation and uproar. But it feels like that was 23 years ago, maybe. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it feels like for the last 23 years, it's just a place to get rich, like
I guess, yeah, some people are, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe not everyone. No, I thought that was. I thought of that when I thought of what Hitler did with art, because I think there's essentially, in the wider public, avant-garde art isn't popular, and I was working in kind of arts journalism when in the 90s when that sensation show was on, and it was routine really for everyone to say, "Oh, this is just rubbish," and even big time art critics would say it was rubbish. people like Brian Sewell, or anyway.
Yeah.
But I think the political value for Hitler was he could tell people it was rubbish, and that would chime with a large percentage of the population, and so it became a kind of something they could agree on, and a way to draw people into his politics, because they thought he was talking sense.
Yeah, and I guess he was making it manifest through his use of theatrics and architecture like that. Speer's kind of grandiose designs for rallies and places of focus. It all, like, art is intrinsic to Hitler and his rule, which I think is why this book is incredible, because art is such a rich thread that runs through, but has never really been explored. So yeah, congratulations. I feel like we've covered pretty much everything, actually, like the propaganda, the key figures like the hero of the book, Franz Karl Bühler. So yeah, I guess this is where I just say, like, everyone, thank you for attending and listening to Charlie share his work and research and what is an incredible book. Charlie, thank you so much for your time and for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you, Lloyd. Thank you for inviting me. Yeah, it's been really nice.